There is something profoundly misunderstood about the avoidant heart. People often assume that when someone pulls away, they do not care. When they go silent, they have forgotten. When they create distance, they have moved on. But distance is not always detachment. Silence is not always freedom. And running is not always the absence of love. You must understand this. The avoidant does not fear your love because it is weak. They fear it because it is powerful. And when an avoidant encounters a super empath, someone whose love is not rooted in control, but in truth, not in desperation, but in divine self-respect, something extraordinary happens. For perhaps the first time in their life, they meet someone they cannot easily categorize. Someone who does not chase, yet deeply cares. Someone who does not force, yet profoundly impacts. Someone who sees beyond the mask. And that is unsettling, because super empaths do not merely touch the surface. They awaken the soul. They become the mirror that reflects back everything the avoidant has spent years trying not to face. Their fear of abandonment. Their fear of inadequacy. Their fear that if they truly let someone in, they may lose control. You see, avoidants are often masters of emotional survival. They learn somewhere along the way that needing less feels safer than risking more. So they build walls, not because they are heartless, but because somewhere deep down they believe vulnerability is dangerous. Then enters the super empath. A super empath does not love to rescue. They love to reveal. They reveal possibilities. They reveal wounds. They reveal truth. And truth is difficult to escape once you've experienced it. This is why avoidants often struggle to fully detach. Because while they may leave your presence, they cannot easily leave the feeling of being truly seen. Your energy becomes a reference point. Your love becomes a standard. Your presence becomes a question they cannot silence. Why did this feel different? And that question follows them. Because a super empath does not just offer affection. They offer transformation. Now here is where wisdom becomes essential. This does not mean your purpose is to wait for someone's awakening. Your divine assignment is not to convince someone to choose you. Your purpose is to remain aligned with your worth so completely that your presence becomes an invitation, not an obligation. Because real love cannot be forced. Healing cannot be dragged. And emotional maturity cannot be borrowed. The super empath's true power is not in holding on, it is in knowing when to let go with grace. And ironically, that is often what leaves the deepest imprint on the avoidant. When they realize you are not trying to imprison them, only love them. When they realize your absence is not punishment but consequence. When they discover that your compassion had boundaries, they are forced to confront a truth greater than loss. They did not lose someone ordinary. They lost someone extraordinary because they were too afraid to receive what they prayed for. So if you have ever loved an avoidant, hear this clearly. Their inability to fully meet you is not proof that you were not enough. Sometimes your love was so profound that it exposed how much healing they still had left to do. Do not shrink your heart to fit inside someone else's fear. Do not confuse their inconsistency with your inadequacy. And do not mistake your capacity to love deeply as a curse. It is a gift, but gifts must be placed where they are honored. The right soul will not fear your depth. They will meet it. The right person will not run from your light. They will rise to the challenge. So stand firm, not in bitterness, but in truth. Not in resentment, but in purpose. Because the divine lesson is this. Some people enter your life not to keep you small, but to teach you that your love is powerful enough to shake even the most guarded heart. And whether they choose healing or hiding, your mission remains the same. Protect your peace, honor your worth, and never forget the love that is truly meant for you will never require you to abandon yourself. What makes a super empath unforgettable to an avoidant is not intensity alone, it is safety. And this is where so many people misunderstand the deeper psychology of connection. Avoidants are not always running from love itself. More often, they are running from what love has historically meant to them. Pressure, disappointment, engulfment, loss of independence, or the terrifying possibility of being fully known and then rejected. For many avoidants, emotional closeness has been subconsciously linked to danger. Somewhere in their life, vulnerability may have felt unsafe. Perhaps love became associated with criticism. Perhaps intimacy felt unpredictable. Perhaps depending on others led to pain. So they adapted. They learned to protect themselves not necessarily by avoiding people, but by avoiding exposure. They become experts at keeping one foot out the door. They may crave connection, even deeply desire it, but when someone gets too close, their nervous system interprets that closeness as risk. This is why casual relationships, emotional distance, or surface-level dynamics can often feel more manageable to them. There is less at stake, less chance of being consumed, less chance of losing control. Then comes the super empath. And unlike others, the super empath's power is not in forcing intimacy. It is in creating emotional safety without demanding surrender. This distinction changes everything. A super empath has an extraordinary ability to make people feel seen without feeling invaded. They listen beyond words. They notice pain beneath patterns. They often recognize the wound beneath the withdrawal. And for an avoidant, this can feel both deeply comforting and profoundly disarming, because for perhaps the first time, they are experiencing connection that does not immediately feel like a trap. The super empath does not say, "Open up now, or I'll leave." They do not weaponize vulnerability. They do not constantly pressure for emotional performance. Instead, their presence often communicates, "I see your fear, but I am not here to control you. I recognize your distance, but I do not need to chase you. I value connection, but I will not force what must be freely given." To someone whose defenses were built around self-protection, this kind of energy can feel rare, and rarity creates impact. The avoidant may not even consciously understand why this person feels different. They may simply notice that around this individual, their usual defense mechanisms do not fit as easily. The super empath's calm can soften hyper-independence. Their patience can challenge suspicion. Their grounded affection can introduce a new possibility. Maybe closeness does not always mean losing myself. This is powerful because safety is often more transformative than pursuit. You see, many avoidants are accustomed to relationships that reinforce their fears. When someone chases excessively, demands constantly, or reacts dramatically, it can confirm their internal belief that intimacy is overwhelming. But a super empath often interrupts that narrative. They offer presence without possession, care without coercion, depth without drowning. And that becomes difficult to forget, because emotional safety is one of the rarest experiences for someone who has spent years protecting themselves from emotional pain. Yet here is the paradox. Safety can also be terrifying. Why? Because when someone no longer feels dangerous, the avoidant loses one of their primary justifications for distance. If the super empath is kind, emotionally intelligent, patient, and self-respecting, then the avoidant is left facing a deeper truth. The issue may not be them. It may be my fear. And that realization can trigger internal conflict. Part of them feels drawn in because this connection feels healthier than what they are used to. Another part wants to retreat because true safety invites vulnerability, and vulnerability means surrendering old survival strategies. This is why avoidants often feel profoundly impacted by super empaths even when they pull away. Because the super empath represents something their heart has longed for and their defenses have feared. They may distance themselves physically, but internally the experience lingers. The memory of being accepted without pressure, understood without judgment, cared for without control, that is not easily replaced. Because what the super empath offered was not merely affection, it was sanctuary. And for a person who has spent much of their life emotionally bracing for impact, sanctuary can become one of the most magnetic, confusing, and unforgettable experiences of all. One of the deepest reasons avoidants struggle to forget super empaths is because super empaths do something most people never do. They awaken what has been buried. And buried emotions do not disappear simply because they have been ignored. They wait. They settle beneath years of distraction, independence, busyness, or emotional detachment, often hidden so deeply that even the avoidant may believe they are unaffected. But avoidance is rarely the absence of feeling. More often, it is the strategic suppression of feeling. This is an important distinction. Many avoidants have not mastered emotional freedom. They have mastered emotional compartmentalization. They have learned how to function without fully processing, how to disconnect before dependency forms, how to intellectualize instead of feel, how to withdraw when emotions become too intense. To the outside world, this can appear like strength, like control, like indifference. But beneath that carefully maintained distance is often an emotional world that has not been healed, only managed. Then enters the super empath. The super empath possesses a rare emotional sensitivity that reaches beyond surface behavior. They are not easily distracted by avoidance tactics alone. They often sense what is unspoken. They notice shifts in tone, silence, hesitation, contradiction. They recognize that behind coldness can be fear, behind distance can be pain, behind detachment can be grief. This can feel unsettling to an avoidant because their greatest defense has often been invisibility. If no one truly sees the wound, then no one can touch it. But super empaths have a way of gently illuminating emotional truths without even trying to force them. Their questions may feel deeper. Their presence may feel more penetrating. Their compassion may expose places the avoidant has carefully hidden from the world and from themselves. And suddenly, emotions long buried begin to stir. Not because the super empath is creating those feelings, but because they are activating what was already there. This is why avoidants can sometimes become emotionally reactive, confused, or inconsistent around super empaths. The connection is not merely relational, it is revelatory. A super empath can unintentionally remind them of unmet needs, forgotten heartbreak, childhood wounds, abandonment fears, the grief of never fully being understood. This emotional awakening can be both beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful, because part of the avoidant may feel more alive than they have in years. Terrifying, because feeling deeply again means confronting pain they thought they had escaped. And here lies the paradox. Avoidants often crave profound connection, but when that connection begins unlocking suppressed emotions, their instinct may be to retreat. Not because the empath is wrong for them, but because the emotional intensity feels unfamiliar. When someone has spent years surviving by suppressing vulnerability, awakening can feel like losing control. Imagine living in an emotional house where certain rooms have been locked for years. A super empath does not break down the doors, but their presence may quietly inspire those doors to open. And once opened, the avoidant cannot entirely unsee what is inside. This is why super empaths often leave a lasting imprint. They are associated not just with romance or attachment, but with emotional resurrection. They become linked to the moment someone started feeling again. Even if the avoidant pulls away, distracts themselves, or attempts to return to old patterns, something has shifted. They now know what it felt like to be emotionally stirred. They remember what it was like to have hidden parts of themselves reflected back with compassion. They cannot fully erase the awareness that beneath their detachment exists a deeper emotional reality. This can create profound internal tension, because once you've been awakened, numbness no longer feels the same. And that is why super empaths are often difficult to forget. They do not simply occupy space in an avoidant's life. They touch space within the avoidant. They awaken dormant truths. They stir sleeping emotions. They challenge carefully constructed emotional walls not through force, but through presence. And while an avoidant may run from discomfort, the soul often remembers what woke it. One of the greatest misconceptions about avoidance is believing that their distance means they do not want connection. In reality, many avoidants do want love. They want closeness. They want understanding. They want partnership. What they often fear is not connection itself. It is vulnerability. This distinction changes everything. Because when people misunderstand avoidance, they assume if they cared, they would stay, or if they loved deeply, they would move closer. But the avoidance struggle is often far more complex than a lack of desire. Many are internally torn between longing for intimacy and fearing what intimacy demands. They may deeply crave emotional closeness, while simultaneously resisting the exposure that true closeness requires. Why? Because connection can feel beautiful, but vulnerability can feel dangerous. To be vulnerable is to be seen beyond the mask, to risk needing someone, to allow another person access to fears, insecurities, wounds, and unmet needs. And for someone who has learned consciously or unconsciously that dependence may lead to pain, disappointment, rejection, or loss of control, vulnerability can activate profound inner alarm. So rather than avoiding love, they often avoid the perceived risks attached to it. This is why avoidance may appear contradictory. They may pursue someone intensely, then retreat when things become serious. They may express affection, then grow distant after emotional depth increases. They may miss someone profoundly, yet resist reaching out. To others, this can seem confusing or even cruel, but internally it often reflects emotional conflict. I want this connection, but I am terrified of what happens if I fully surrender to it. This is where super empaths become especially impactful. A super empath often offers precisely what the avoidant secretly desires: depth without immediate judgment, love without manipulation, presence without control. And this can create an emotional experience that feels both magnetic and threatening. Because now, the avoidant is not just facing abstract intimacy. They are facing real intimacy. For perhaps the first time, they meet someone whose emotional depth invites them to lower their defenses. Someone who sees beyond performance, Someone who does not merely want their attention but their truth. And truth requires vulnerability. This is why avoidants can become deeply attached to super empaths, even while pulling away. The empath represents possibility. The possibility of being loved while truly known. The possibility of connection without pretense. The possibility that intimacy may not always destroy freedom. But possibility also introduces fear, because if they allow themselves to fully receive this kind of love, they must confront everything they've built to protect themselves. Their independence may no longer feel like strength alone, it may reveal itself as armor. Their emotional distance may no longer feel empowering, it may feel lonely. Their self-protection may no longer seem necessary, it may seem costly. And that realization can be overwhelming, so they retreat, not always because they want less, but because they feel too much. This is one of the painful ironies of avoidance. Sometimes people withdraw most intensely when something matters deeply. Not because they are unaffected, but because the stakes feel higher. A casual connection may not threaten their emotional defenses, but a profound one, that can shake the entire structure. And yet, even when they create physical distance, emotional detachment is not always so simple. Because once someone has touched the deeper parts they rarely reveal, forgetting becomes difficult. The avoidant may leave the conversation, but they often carry the impact. They remember the person who made them feel safe enough to almost open. The person who challenged their narrative that vulnerability always ends badly. The person who made them question whether love might actually be worth the risk. This is why avoidants can seem emotionally absent while remaining psychologically attached. They are not always detached from the person. Sometimes they are wrestling with what that person awakened. The super empath often becomes unforgettable, not because they demanded intimacy, but because they exposed how deeply the avoidant desired it. And once someone has glimpsed the possibility of genuine connection, even fear cannot fully erase that truth. Avoidants survive by building emotional defenses. These defenses are rarely random. They are carefully developed survival strategies, patterns formed over time to protect against discomfort, disappointment, rejection, or the terrifying unpredictability of deep emotional exposure. For many avoidants, these defenses may look like independence, emotional distance, delayed responses, intellectualizing feelings, minimizing needs, or retreating when intimacy deepens. To the outside world, these behaviors can appear cold, confusing, or even uncaring. But often beneath these patterns is not the absence of emotion, it is protection from emotion. Avoidants do not always construct walls because they feel nothing. They build them because at some point, feeling too much may have seemed unsafe. So they create systems of control, systems of distance, systems that allow them to engage just enough to experience connection, but not so deeply that they risk losing emotional sovereignty. And for a while, these defenses can seem effective, until they meet a super empath. Because super empaths often challenge emotional defenses in ways that are not aggressive but transformative. A super empath does not necessarily storm the fortress. They illuminate it. This is what makes their impact so profound. Where others may react to avoidance with pressure, blame, or pursuit, the super empath often responds differently. They observe, they intuit, they recognize patterns beneath behavior. They notice that the dismissiveness may conceal fear, that inconsistency may conceal overwhelm, that withdrawal may conceal emotional conflict. This level of perception can feel deeply unsettling to an avoidant, because emotional defenses often rely on misunderstanding. If people assume, "I just don't care," then the deeper truth remains hidden. If others react only to surface distance, the internal wound stays protected. But super empaths often sense more. And when someone begins to see beyond the defense itself can start to weaken. Not because the avoidant consciously chooses to lower it, but because true emotional insight challenges false protective narratives. For example, if an avoidant believes, "If I get too close, I will lose myself," the super empath's balanced presence may quietly contradict that. If they believe, "People always demand too much," the empath's patience may challenge it. If they believe, "Being known is dangerous," the empath's compassion may soften that fear. This is powerful because emotional walls are often reinforced by past experiences, but they are destabilized by new ones. The super empath becomes a living contradiction to old assumptions, and contradiction creates tension. Part of the avoidant may feel relief. "This feels safer than I expected." Another part may feel panic. "If this is safe, then why have I spent so long hiding?" This is where defenses often intensify before they dissolve. When avoidants feel their walls being challenged, they may retreat harder, they may create confusion, they may sabotage, they may suddenly emphasize flaws, distance, or reasons the connection won't work. This is not always because the super empath lacks value. Often, it is because the connection is penetrating defenses that once felt essential for survival. The super empath's greatest challenge to the avoidant is not their love alone, it is their consistency. Consistency is disruptive to someone accustomed to emotional unpredictability. Patience is disruptive to someone expecting pressure. Depth is disruptive to someone who survives on surface. And perhaps most threatening of all, a super empath often demonstrates that love can exist without domination. This forces the avoidant to confront an uncomfortable truth. Maybe the walls are no longer protecting me, maybe they are imprisoning me. That realization can feel both liberating and terrifying, because walls, even painful ones, can become familiar, and familiarity often feels safer than change. This is why avoidants can struggle to fully detach from super empaths. The empath often becomes more than a person. They become a challenge to an entire emotional blueprint. They represent the possibility that intimacy may not be the enemy, that vulnerability may not equal weakness, that emotional openness may not always end in pain. And once someone has genuinely challenged your deepest defenses, forgetting them becomes difficult. Because even if the avoidant walks away physically, the questions remain. What if I was safe? What if love did not require so much fear? What if the walls I trusted most are the very thing keeping me from what I truly want? That is the profound disruption of the super empath. They do not merely challenge avoidance, they challenge the necessity of it. There are some connections that feel ordinary. They are pleasant, temporary, convenient. They may offer companionship, attraction, even affection, but they do not necessarily alter the architecture of the soul. And then there are connections that feel different. Connections that seem to bypass logic. Connections that awaken something ancient, profound, and deeply personal. Connections that leave a person saying, I do not fully understand why this feels so significant, but it does. This is often what happens when an avoidant encounters a super empath, because the bond can feel less like casual attraction and more like emotional destiny. Not necessarily destiny in the fantasy-driven sense of meant to be forever, but in the deeper sense of meaning. This person came into my life to reveal something. Darned age revelation has power. Avoidants often operate through control. They may rely on logic, distance, and self-protection to navigate relationships. They are skilled at categorizing people, managing emotional exposure, and preserving enough distance to maintain internal safety. But super empaths can disrupt this structure because the connection often feels difficult to reduce to ordinary explanation. Why? Because super empaths do not merely offer chemistry. They often offer recognition. Recognition of hidden pain. Recognition of emotional contradictions. Recognition of the parts the avoidant rarely exposes. And to feel profoundly seen sometimes beyond words can create a sense that the relationship carries unusual significance. For some avoidants, this can feel spiritual. Not necessarily in a religious sense, but in the sense that something deeper than surface attraction is being activated. The super empath may feel like a mirror, a catalyst, a lesson, a turning point. This can be deeply unsettling because avoidants are often more comfortable with relationships they can intellectually manage. But spiritually significant connections do not always fit neat emotional compartments. They stir, they challenge, they linger. The avoidant may try to explain the intensity away. Maybe it was just timing, maybe it was chemistry, maybe I'm overthinking. But significance is difficult to dismiss when someone has touched dimensions of you that others rarely reach. And this is why behavioral detachment does not always equal emotional release. An avoidant may physically distance themselves. They may stop communicating. They may create practical reasons to disconnect. But internally, the imprint can remain. Because spiritual significance often transcends ordinary memory. It becomes symbolic. The super empath may represent the first person who truly understood me. The first person who challenged my fear. The first person who made me feel emotionally exposed yet safe. The first person who revealed what love could feel like beyond defense. This is why avoidants can struggle to fully forget super empaths. Not simply because they miss the person, but because they miss what the connection awakened. A spiritually significant bond often creates questions that outlive the relationship itself. Why did they affect me so deeply? Why do I still think about them? Why does no one else feel quite the same? These questions are powerful because they are not merely about longing. They are about transformation. The super empath often becomes associated with a chapter of awakening, and awakening cannot be entirely undone. Even if the avoidant chooses distance, they may carry the realization that someone once touched their life in a way that challenged old patterns. Someone once reflected back a version of themselves they had not fully considered. Someone once made them confront the possibility that love could be both deep and healing. This can feel divine because divine experiences often involve revelation. They expose truth, they dismantle illusion, they invite growth. And whether the avoidant embraces that growth or resists it, the significance remains. Because profound connections are not always measured by duration. Sometimes they are measured by disruption, by how deeply they altered perception, by how powerfully they challenged fear, by how permanently they changed what someone believes is possible. So while avoidants may detach in action, their soul may still wrestle with the encounter. Because some people do not simply enter your life to be experienced. They enter to awaken. And once the soul has been awakened by someone who felt rare, divinely timed, or profoundly revealing, their absence may create distance, but their significance can remain. One of the deepest reasons avoidants struggle to detach from super empaths is because super empaths often embody what avoidants secretly crave, but have spent much of their lives fearing. This is the painful paradox. The very thing an avoidant may desire most can also be the very thing that terrifies them most. Because beneath emotional distance, self-protection, and carefully maintained independence, many avoidants are not empty. They are longing. Longing for peace, longing for acceptance, longing for love that does not feel conditional, longing for closeness without suffocation, longing to be understood without being controlled. In other words, they often crave emotional freedom, but craving something and feeling safe enough to receive it are not the same. This is where the super empath becomes profoundly impactful. A super empath often represents a kind of love that feels rare, love with depth but not domination, love with patience but not passivity, love with understanding but not self-abandonment. This kind of presence can feel like everything the avoidant's heart has quietly wished for, and yet it can also feel dangerous. Why? Because when someone embodies what you truly want, they become the person you want to be. They do more than offer possibility, they expose the distance between your current reality and your deeper desire. For an avoidant, this can be emotionally confronting. A super empath's emotional openness may reveal how guarded they are. Their healthy vulnerability may reveal how deeply they fear being known. Their consistency may reveal how much chaos or emotional unpredictability they have normalized. Their compassion may reveal how harshly they judge their own needs. This can create an internal mirror that is difficult to ignore. And mirrors can be uncomfortable, because suddenly the avoidant is not simply interacting with someone attractive or kind. They are interacting with a living representation of emotional freedom. Freedom to feel deeply. Freedom to express honestly. Freedom to love without constant defense. And if they have spent years equating protection with survival, this kind of freedom can feel both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because part of them recognizes, this is what I've wanted. Terrifying because another part whispers, but to receive this, I may have to change. And change can feel like loss. Loss of familiar coping mechanisms. Loss of emotional control. Loss of protective narratives such as, I don't need anyone. I'm better off detached. Love is too risky. The super empath challenges these narratives simply by existing. Their presence can force avoidants to confront a profound truth. Perhaps I do want more than distance. Perhaps I do want to be understood. Perhaps what I call independence is sometimes fear. This realization can create tremendous emotional tension. Because while the avoidant may deeply admire or desire what the super empath offers, receiving it requires confronting old wounds. To accept deep love may mean grieving past disappointments. To embrace emotional safety may mean acknowledging how long they've lived in defense. To choose intimacy may mean risking pain. So instead of moving closer, some avoidants retreat. Not because the empath lacks value, but because the value feels immense. The super empath becomes symbolic of a life beyond fear, a love beyond defense, a possibility beyond old limitations. And possibility can feel overwhelming when someone has built their identity around emotional self-protection. This is why avoidants may pull away while remaining emotionally impacted. They are not always escaping the person. Sometimes they are escaping what the person reveals. Because to stay may require growth. To stay may require vulnerability. To stay may require becoming someone new. Yet even if they leave, the imprint often remains. Because once someone has represented your deepest unmet longing, ordinary connections may feel different. The avoidant may compare, consciously or unconsciously. They may remember what it felt like to be offered genuine understanding. They may miss the emotional freedom they glimpsed, but struggled to embrace. And this is why super empaths can become unforgettable. They are not merely loved. They are often experienced as a reflection of what is possible. A possibility the avoidant may not yet feel ready for, but one's soul recognizes. Because when someone embodies both the love you crave and the healing you fear, detachment becomes complicated. You may walk away physically. You may resist emotionally. You may retreat mentally. But part of you often remembers. That was the kind of love I secretly wanted, even if I was not yet ready to receive it. One of the most misunderstood truths about avoidance is this. Distance does not always mean disinterest. In fact, some of the people who appear the most detached are not detached because they feel nothing, but because they feel more than they know how to manage. This is where so many people misread avoidant behavior. They see withdrawal and assume indifference. They experience silence and assume emotional absence. They witness inconsistency and conclude they never cared. But for many avoidants, detachment is not necessarily a reflection of emotional emptiness. It is often a strategy of regulation, a coping mechanism, a form of self-preservation, a way of creating enough distance to prevent overwhelming emotions from consuming them. This distinction is powerful because it changes the question from, do they feel, to, how do they handle what they feel? Many avoidants learned, consciously or unconsciously, that intense emotions can threaten stability. Perhaps closeness once led to disappointment. Perhaps vulnerability once resulted in pain. Perhaps dependence once felt unsafe. So instead of developing mastery over emotional processing, they develop mastery over emotional distancing. They learn to pull back before things got too deep, to create space when emotions intensified, to suppress longing before it became need, to convince themselves they are fine rather than face internal chaos. This can create the illusion that they are detached, but often what appears as detachment is actually emotional overload filtered through self-protection. And this is why super empaths can become especially difficult to detach from. Because super empaths do not usually provoke shallow emotions. They provoke depth. Their presence often stirs buried vulnerability, hidden desires, unmet needs, and emotional truths that avoidants may have spent years suppressing. This can become incredibly overwhelming. The avoidant may think, why does this person affect me so much? Why do I care this deeply? Why does this feel harder to control? And because control often feels synonymous with safety, their instinct may be to create distance. Not necessarily because they want less, but because they do not know how to safely hold more. This is why detachment can become a strategy, rather than a genuine emotional exit. They may stop texting, avoid difficult conversations, prioritize distractions, convince themselves they need space. But internally, their emotional world may still be highly active. They may replay conversations, think about what was lost, wonder what could have been, feel relief and grief simultaneously. This inner contradiction can be exhausting. Part of them seeks freedom from emotional intensity. Another part remains attached to the significance of the bond. This is especially true with super empaths because the empath often represents more than romance. They represent emotional exposure. They are the person who made avoidance harder. The person who stirred feelings defenses could not fully suppress. The person who challenged the narrative that detachment equals peace. And this can leave a lasting psychological imprint. Because even if the avoidant chooses physical or emotional distance, the unresolved feelings do not automatically disappear. Suppressed emotion often lingers. It may resurface later through memory, comparison, regret, curiosity, or sudden emotional waves. It may appear when new relationships feel less meaningful. It may emerge when loneliness exposes what distraction once concealed. This is why some avoidants circle back. Not always because they have fully healed, but because detachment did not erase impact. The strategy created distance. It did not always create closure. And this is the tragedy of emotional self-protection. Sometimes the very mechanism designed to prevent pain also prevents resolution. So the avoidant may continue carrying the connection internally, even while externally appearing gone, because strategy can separate bodies, but it cannot always silence the soul. And when someone has profoundly affected hidden emotional layers, strategic detachment often becomes complicated. The avoidant may run not because the connection was meaningless, but because it mattered enough to disrupt their equilibrium. This is why super empaths can remain unforgettable. They are often not the person an avoidant felt least for, but the person they felt too much for, before they had the tools to stay. Thank you for your time and attention. May you carry clarity, strength, and emotional peace into everything you pursue. Goodbye, and may your path always lead you toward deeper understanding, growth, and meaningful connection.